right. Well, we're here on the podcast with Dr. Richard Beck. For those of you that aren't as familiar, Richard serves at Abilene Christian University in Texas, and he's a psychologist and then also writes prolifically on a blog, Experimental Theology. You're published, how many books, Richard? I didn't see the number on your bio.
I think 7 right now, but I got an 8th one called The Shape of Joy coming out in October.
Okay. So lots of good books. I was just mentioning to Richard that I've got several of his. I got this one, The Slavery of Death. I got a chance to read and even give a little shout out about hunting magic eels, which is a pretty cool honor. So Richard, we kind of become friends, which is kind of a weird thing. I was telling my parents that I was like, I'm going to have a conversation with Richard Beck, and they were kind of like, how is he so free? I mean, like, he's like a big deal. And I was like, well, he's a big deal, but he's a lesser big deal than some big deals. I don't know. How would you describe yourself?
Yeah, like a B-list celebrity.
B-list podcast theologian.
Yeah, I'm like those celebrities that hang out with Ryan Seacrest on New Year's Eve. You know, like people that kind of looking for a gig. You know, just willing to show up for any sort of show, whatever.
That's funny. Well, but I mean, you have some legit connections, but then more than that, a legit experience and stuff. Talk a little bit for those that maybe haven't read any of your reflections on your work in the prison ministry, because I think this is one of the things that makes you not just a kind of a cool celebrity. You've written a book, but you actually do this work of being intentional, studying faith and sharing about it with people in prison, which is something I guess Jesus talks about. But yeah, talk to us a little bit about how did that come about, and what has that Bible study kind of been for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I write books, but I don't consider that my main profession. I mean, I mainly describe myself as a teacher. I love teaching. Teaching's my passion, and I'm also a church person. I'm deeply invested as a leader. I'm an elder at my church and a Bible class teacher, and involved in the ministries of that church. But about 10 years ago, I became a prison chaplain at a maximum security unit here in Abilene and teach a Bible study out there every Monday night. And I've told that story a lot in my books because that was a really transformative and important experience in my life. But again, it's me also trying to kind of put flesh and bones upon my faith and the things I write about. I think I want to be a person that has a lot of integrity about what they say and what they write, that I'm actually living it, and that the person that my family sees or my church sees, my students see, is the same person they see in a book or on a podcast or online.
Yeah. Well, I can say, having been one of those people that got to host you and the hospitality piece of you staying with my family, that's the description, the real deal. And so I've been reading your blog, and one of the devotionals series you're doing right now on the Psalms, kind of every Friday, really jumped out at me when I was kind of starting the year. I think it was January 5th. You wrote a little bit about Psalm 31, which has some interesting phrases, but for me, the big one is how it just begins. In you, Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be put to shame. Deliver me in your righteousness. And I think we're struggling, at least in my family unit, to kind of take refuge in God and not in kind of some of these ways to explain our ideologies and different things. And so then the psalm continues with this refrain and with this request to put your hope in the Lord. Verse 24 ends that way. Be strong and take heart, all of you who hope in the Lord. But it's an election year, and it's feeling a little bit hard to do that. So your blog post kind of just came out and just was like, "Yep, I'm not super looking forward to this. In fact, I think it's going to be a dumpster fire. I think it's actually not going to go well." I mean, it was just. I remember reflecting with my dad, who both of us share pretty distinct, different views on Trump and things. So that's, just being a little vulnerable myself. Like I find myself often having anxious kind of conversations with my parents because we just see this so differently. And having a conversation with them after reading this post, I was just like, man, Richard and I are kind of looking at this as a dumpster fire, and so how do we do this? How do we put our hope in the Lord? And I guess I'm just gonna let you take it from there. Like, are you more hopeful than you were on January 5th, or as we get closer to the election, still feeling like it's going to be a dumpster fire?
Well, I'll say that it swings back and forth, right? The hopelessness or the despair. So here's one story I'll tell. On Wednesday nights, I um, uh, go to a little tiny mission church called Freedom Fellowship, and I remember 2016 when Trump lost. All my friends who were Republicans were no, that was when Trump won in 2016. When Trump won, all my liberal Democratic friends who came to the church service that evening were just despondent and despairing, and so I just happened to be there on that Wednesday night, the day after the election on Tuesday. And so the title of my lesson that night was "How to Lose an Election." So I told all my liberal progressive friends, how do Christians lose an election in a hopeful, faithful way? But then 4 years later, it flip-flopped, and all my Republican friends came to church, and I again was preaching the Wednesday after election night, and I gave the exact same sermon. How to lose how to lose an election. And for them, because obviously they were very anxious, and there was some conspiratorial stuff going on about whether or not the election had been stolen. I mean, so they had all these anxieties as well, and that all eventually culminated in the January 6th, riots at the Capitol or whatever. So they had their own anxieties that were on full display as well. And so my concerns are for both groups. And it depending on who's going to lose this next election. And it does seem that these elections have become more high stakes for a lot of people, that the world is increasingly hanging on the balance every election cycle, and that you're having these very outsized reactions about history tipping into, or has it ever been worse than it has been right now? And what's interesting is, like, I've been watching just recently that Ken Burns documentary on the Vietnam War. And I mean, and not that long ago in American history, things were worse. Right now we think, well, things have never been worse. Well, they actually were. If you just lean into that history, things were really bad. And so the question is then, why have we then lost perspective, perhaps even a historical perspective about that? And my argument that I made when I was on your campus was that I think politics have become maybe too important for us. We've become overly invested in them. And to connect it back with Psalm 31, we aren't trusting in the Lord. We are trusting rather in Washington, D.C. And as our hopes lean increasingly upon electoral politics, we're having these very, very strong emotional responses depending on how elections are won or lost.
Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned I'm a Tolkien fan, so I appreciated the reference. That history is a long defeat. That there's a little bit of a we shouldn't expect anything other than this kind of political thing to be a dumpster fire. I wonder though, as I talk with friends, and I spend time actually with our tradition, the Churches of Christ, and our Christian church kind of siblings. And then I also spend time with the Disciples of Christ in my role at the university here, which politically tend towards two extremes as we find our way in the political, how to approach politics and how to see faith involved. And at a recent event, I was actually listening to an audiobook about the problems with evangelicalism and kind of alignment with the Republican Party and the moral majority and a history of that. And as I was listening to that, the speeches that were recorded and kind of segments or quotes from those speeches, I then heard a very similar phrase at a Disciples of Christ event speaking about the need to rise up in the name of justice. And the speaker actually caught themselves and said, no, I'm not talking about physical violence or anything like that. Like they qualified, like I'm not meaning that we should actually resort to violence. But the phrasing was almost exactly the same. And I realized, like, man, this doesn't seem like either group of Christians have a handle on what that means. They both think there is a solution, and that solution involves one particular party being more in power than the other. So, you kind of make a statement, Christians know how to live through a dumpster fire. So how do we do that? Like how, and a little bit of what you were talking about when you were on our campus was saying, I think faith is a better boat or vehicle for us to put our hope in. Okay, so Richard, I'm going to press you. How do we do that? Because I'm hanging out with two people who we're saying prayers beforehand. We're singing worship songs. We're reading from the Bible in both groups, but we're both kind of living in this anxious way.
Yeah. Well, let me go back to that Tolkien quote. I quote Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings. He has this phrase, that history of Middle Earth is this long defeat, and it's a phrase that Tolkien uses in his correspondence, where he describes history as being a long defeat, and so I do think it's proper for a Christian to have if not a pessimistic, then a very realistic view of what politics can and cannot accomplish within history. And I think the Bible gives ample evidence to this. If you look at the theocracy of Israel, and we often look back to the theocracy of Israel as like some sort of exemplar of behind the imagination of Christian nationalism. But if you just look at the trajectory of the kings of Israel and Judah, that doesn't end well. That ends in a dumpster fire. They end in exile. And then when I talk about Christians know how to live through the historical dumpster fire, I'm just pointing to the book of Revelation. That all through Revelation, as you see the beasts, take over the world, and massive corruption and political idolatry and economic exploitation, we get these divisions of the faithful in the midst of the historical dumpster fire. And that only gets resolved not within history, but by God's kind of apocalyptic intervention at the end of times. Now, how do you hold though that, and this I think is where it's difficult, how do you hold that realism or even that pessimism about what can or cannot be realistically accomplished with the great privilege of having democratic power and examples within our history from like the civil rights movement or whatever that I can actually affect history. The idea of progressivism or liberalism is that we can make progress, and so let's not become apathetic, but become invested. So how do you become invested in the political process that can actually change the lives of our neighbors, and yet do that with a degree of realism and humility? And so to answer your question, I think one of my biggest concerns is how we've kind of lost a local imagination for political engagement. One of the big shifts that has happened over the last few generations is how kind of communal spaces, third spaces where we engaged with our local community. Politics, was local. We would read our daily newspapers. And we also engaged with each other as neighbors who are different from us. That is, as those spaces have evaporated, our political imagination has shifted away from the local to the national. And it's typically more mediated now, not through local organizations, but rather through social media. And so so the only game in town now is Washington, D.C. So if I want to make a difference in the world, then I don't think about doing something in my local neighborhood. I think of winning an election. So I think that is one problem that we need to fight with. And so I tell a lot of my younger students, like, if you want to change the world, don't obsess about the elections, but volunteer in your local neighborhood. Know your neighbors, bump into some people, and actually do physical things. Don't just make your activism social media emphasis, but like do actual things in your neighborhood. Because not only does that get you, reshapes your imagination about what change really looks like. And we used to have a name for this. We'd call it like community organization or community, or where it was a grassroots kind of movement. We've lost those skill sets to kind of talk to people on their porches about, like, hey, what's good for you? What politics are good for you? And talk through our differences. Like, we've lost all of those civic capacities of conversation, and we're just dealing with disembodied people on social media, and the algorithms of social media kind of push us increasingly apart. And so I think what used to be a pragmatic conversation in politics about how to balance competing goods has increasingly become like a form of holy war, a battle of good against evil. And I think that's why elections seem so high stakes, because it's the evil people are winning, and so it seems a little bit more apocalyptic. And I think you see it playing out in Congress, because we vote people into the Congress who have been marinating in this very polarized kind of rhetoric, and so they bring that kind of zero sum imagination into Congress, and so Congress can't compromise, because you can't compromise with evil. And I think that's probably, I'd say, the biggest diagnosis of our political problems right now is that we're instead of compromise being the mechanism of politics, compromise has become moral failure, capitulating to evil, and it's like the sin of the Holy Spirit in Scripture. When you start calling good things evil, then you're lost. Your moral compass is broken, and so when compromise has become associated with evil, then I don't know how politics can work. So those are a few things. I think getting off social media, getting engaged in local service, where you can meet your neighbors. I think are two ways that we can um, uh, form our imaginations a bit differently than they currently are being formed.
Yeah. So as you were talking in the session at Bushnell in 23 on kind of polarization and stuff, you mentioned that kind of our personal container, this hero game of politics, has corrupted us a little bit, and we need better moral resources. And so you named some, like things like mercy and forgiveness and grace and gratitude, humility, reconciliation, love, love for one's enemies. So 2024 has kind of become a year on mercy for me, and partly that was just happenstance. I got asked to preach on mercy and given a text, and it was like, okay, what do I have to say about this word that feels kind of detached? And I would say some of these things, like these moral resources, they can kind of feel intellectualized, like they're over there or they're in a book. And as I've kind of tried to figure out how to make mercy more concrete, more practiced in my life, I've thought, like, wow, this is harder, a lot harder than I want it to be. So thinking about, maybe you can take a stab at mercy and what you think of that. What would it mean for us to be people of mercy in an election year. And, I'm thinking about my family members. I'm thinking specifically about some of my neighbors. But I'm also thinking about like myself and having,
Mhm.
because I think sometimes shame is involved with the way we double down on there's a right and a wrong, a black and white zero sum game. And perhaps as we don't pay attention to the things that are stirred in us, these feelings of like, wow, I really don't see a way out, a way forward. And so then I kind of react, often not based on a logical thing about like, well, this is a conspiracy, or this is I'm not intellectually engaging with it as much as I'm reacting to the emotions that have stirred within me. And I wonder if there's opportunity even to show mercy to ourselves, that would lower the temperature. But yeah, take a stab at kind of saying what could mercy look like in an election year.
Yeah, I mean, back to go back and kind of describe something about that kind of the idea of the hero game, before we get to the conversation of mercy, because I think they're connected. Is when I was on your campus, I was describing how like in an increasingly post-Christian culture, as institutionalized religion kind of fades, that we're going to need a receptacle or a repository, some vehicle that will carry my identity, and my values and my worldview. And my argument is that politics is increasingly becoming the receptacle, the vehicle, of my identity and my values. And the point there is obviously then if you vote differently from me, then you are negating or defeating my identity, my values. And thus, that's what I kind of mean by politics means too much. And what I mean by too much, I mean existentially too much. I've become over identified in my politics and therefore winning an election. So I do. So the idea of hoping in the Lord is to somehow extract our values, our identity, our meaning from politics and reinvesting it in a kind of a sacred place that is a place of rest, and also can generate other moral goods like joy and mercy. The trouble with that recommendation is how very much our religion has become politicized on both the left and the right. Where on the progressive side, you see faith increasingly identified with the social justice activism, but on the right, you're seeing it more associated with still culture war issues, gender and sexuality, and those kinds of issues. So that can be sticky to kind of disentangle faith from politics. But I do think that's the first step toward mercy, um, uh, because when people espouse different hero systems, you get implicated in what psychologists call worldview defense. And so we attack instinctively these cultural opponents, and so we do got to do some deep psychological work, that I think creates a capacity for mercy and not kind of a knee jerk hostility. And so how do you do that? I mean, I'll go back to kind of what I just said. Is I really think mercy might have to begin with. Like practices of hospitality, like face to face hospitality. We have to know people, even if we disagree with them, and even if we can't even make sense of how they put the world together. And that goes back to the social media thing, because we are spending so little time with people who are different from us ideologically speaking. They seem like aliens, you know, like for my Republican friends, they just think, those social justice warriors are just aliens. Like they can't even understand how anybody could even think or behave that way. But then from a social justice side of the thing, they look back at Trump supporters and go like, I don't understand the appeal. I don't understand. It just seems like a form of insanity. And and so and so we're going to have to somehow bridge that mutual incomprehensibility. And the only way to do that is to kind of through sitting down over tables and having friendships across these ideological margins where we can kind of hear each other's stories and humanize each other, where in a way that social media doesn't allow us, to do that. And I know that's easy to say because that is very difficult to do. But this is why I think shared labor in your local community can help there, because a lot of my fellow, back to my prison ministry, a lot of my fellow chaplains out at the prison ministry have very different politics than I do. Um, and we're aware of those differences, and yet it helps me to know people on the other side of the political aisle, and I hope it helps them to know me on my side, because we have this other thing that we share that we're deeply invested in. And I think that's so otherwise mercy is just like somehow this, I have to somehow conjure up these compassionate feelings for these people who I think are A, insane, and B, objectively hurting the world. Like that's it's the only way I can see them, and somehow I have to churn up merciful feelings. I really think hospitality, I think it has to start with relationships. And again, but because we're lacking those third spaces in our communities, we that those possibilities have evaporated. Um, and and so we are just really just dealing with screens, and I think we have to figure out a way to kind of get out of that trap.
Yeah, so thinking a little bit about that, okay, what would it look like to be in relationship? I think we come up into the face of like, man, it's really hard to be present when I'm anxious and feeling triggered. So somebody shares a video clip with me or, something online, I can just, turn it off. But it's harder when I'm in face to face and they're saying these things or trying to make a point. They want to have this conversation and I don't want to have the conversation. I leave. Well, now I've just kind of broken relationship. Yeah. And I'm wondering how do we engage in these conversations when the other person may not play by the same rules. And that's, I think, where I'm like, wow, mercy to me has grown, because I mostly think of myself as the one needing, people to be merciful to, because I'm younger in the workplace and different things. But now that I'm a parent, it's changed, because now I'm the one with a lot of the power, and I'm finding myself, it's a lot easier to talk about being merciful, but when I'm tired or I'm just not feeling it, it's a lot harder to be like, yeah, toddler, let's go, run around the park, or I'll give you a push on the swing, or even more serious, like they're having a big feeling and they're crying and pouting about something, and I'm just kind of like, this isn't a big deal. I just want you to be, and sometimes I feel that way. I feel that rising sense of just frustration in political conversations. It's like, no, just turn off the news, or just stop. But that's not merciful either,
Yeah. I think that's a really complicated and deep question, like especially for those of us that have kind of dismaying family relationships or intimates that we just say things that we just find things we just don't not agree with, but things that we think are just really either conspiratorial or delusional or just awful, so there's a little bit more at stake than just like, I disagree about immigration policies, but something that's tipping into actually being racist or like not morally good. It's one thing to disagree about like an orderly immigration process and what that would look like versus things that are fear mongering and unpleasant, and thus you feel stuck between picking a fight with your family members, which is not good, or being silent when people are saying things that are wrong and your kids might be listening, or you feel like your conscience needs you to say something, and So like what you know, it's like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. If I engage, we're going to fight all the time. It's exhausting. If I disengage, then we're not in a relationship anymore. If I stay silent, then I feel like I'm complicit. I'm just and it, being very descriptive. We reached a situation where a lot of us feel like we don't have very many moves to make that are good. And what does it mean to navigate all of that mercifully? And I don't know if there's a rule. I don't know if there's like one rule I can give anybody. I think everybody's going to have to find different places where they're comfortable. What their My wife always talks about like what are you good, to live with? What can you live with here in this situation? And sometimes it might mean some balance of not being present and staying silent and also speaking up. Everybody's going to find that space. And I don't know if I can say anything that's going to make that less awkward or less effortful. I really think it's just going to be. I do think staying engaged is worth the fight. I think love is costly. This is not a very cheerful line, but from the Brothers Karamazov, there's this line that haunts me where it says, "Love is a harsh and dreadful thing." And so, what does it mean to love somebody in my family or my group that espouses very ugly politics? Well, that love is going to be a harsh and dreadful thing because it's going to ask you to be merciful to a person that you just really just want to scream at sometimes. And this might be a really awful analogy, so I'm hesitant to share it, but I did a series on my blog after the last election, after the January 6th stuff, and a lot of my progressive friends were like, I'm just dismayed by the conspiratorial thinking among their family members. And I wrote a blog series about that. And one of the things I said is like, I don't know if you can talk anybody out of these ideas. I don't think just having a yelling match is going to somehow snap them out of that. So you should be if you're going to pick a fight, don't think you're going to change their mind. Um, uh, I think it's something that's going to have to kind of that's a knot that's going to have to ravel itself over time. Um, and if you are going to unravel a knot, you just got to kind of pick at it over time, and introduce other ideas. But some of it's going to take a lot of patience. But the final thing I said is like, what does it mean to love a conspiracy theorist? If some of your family members are conspiracy theorists, and that's going to be a pretty durable thing for at least a season, then what does it mean to love a conspiracy theorist? And I think a lot of people got to figure out, what does it mean to love a Trump supporter? Because they're in my family. But I also think a lot of Trump supporters got to figure out how to love a social justice warrior. Like they got to figure that we got to figure that out, and it's just a lot of work. But I think it's worth it. I think, and even if it's not fulfilling, I think it's what Jesus calls us to do.
Yeah. So my mom's name is Paula, and I think your mom's name is Paula, right? So
Yeah.
I remember after you came to Bushnell, you were at Pepperdine for Bible lectures, and you shared a pretty meaningful lesson on the love of God, and our mission is to make the love of God more believable.
Mm-hmm.
And I was impacted by kind of your illustration of like your mom kind of pulling you down, and I'd love you even if you killed somebody, and I think that as I've dug into mercy, I've really realized like it has no limit. It is foregoing the consequences of somebody's action, and that love demonstrated by Jesus on the cross took him to death. And so as I've been thinking about the slavery of death concept, and how so much of my anxiety, and especially when we're thinking about big things like politics and the fate of our country and the fate of the world, and some of these things that maybe I might be able to say, well, I'm not afraid to die, but my life is connected to some big mission or legacy. And I think we do this even with church and with faith, where we put our kind of trust, our ability to face death in some other container. And
Mm-hmm.
as people threaten that, it's pretty hard. We get violent, and passionate, and so I've been thinking about how do I let go of some of that and make God's love believable? Because I really do think this is the best way we can witness to the love of God in our world today, is if we could simply let people not walk all over us without but at the same point not do it in a way that is not respond in a way that is violent. And I do think the Christian witness is best on display when it is costing us something. And right now, it's hard for me to go walk around and go, oh man, my faith is costing me. Like, it's not costing me economically. It's not costing me, the fact that I can own my own home, and my kids can go to whatever school I want them to go to. Like, there's very little restriction on my life because I'm a Christian. But when I get into the political space, I do feel it's costly at times to say I don't want to align myself one way or the other, and that's I think in some ways a good thing for us to have, not a persecution maybe on the level that that others in other countries are experiencing, but at the same point, perhaps this is a way we can practice a faith that's costly, and by not engaging in politics in a violent way, and not having to have the last word. I mean, that's, I think, something that is really, really hard for me, because
Yeah.
I want to set the record straight.
Mm-hmm. And I also kind of wonder if the social media has also distorted our perceptions um, of what's really happening on the ground. Because I think if you kind of walked through your churches or through your neighborhoods and say, are you kind of exhausted by the current political discourse? Do you find yourself like not really having a home on the left or the right? Do you feel kind of homeless right now? I think there's a significant group of people out there that, again, and they're not really online. They're not overly online kind of people, because that's kind of what's exhausting them. That people just want to live generous, beautiful lives in their neighborhoods, take care of the people that love them. They're not very politically minded. So sometimes I wonder if we might try to figure out a way to model a Christian that can kind of pull those people back into the conversation, because I think they feel so. Like you, I feel like left out a lot. You know, I don't find very much I like on the left or the right, and so feel alone. But I wonder if there's a way that we can. I don't know. There might be more of those people than we think, and that might give us hope during these election seasons that that kind of silent, exhausted majority um, might be what saves us in the end. People looking for a better, more generous conversation.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think if we can avoid pulling those again, those fear kind of strings,
Mm-hmm.
then we're going to be better off. And I'm grateful for voices like you, that remind us to put our hope in the Lord. And I'm grateful for your writings that provide a space for me to engage with family members who disagree, and for ongoing conversations like this about how we can really put this into practice. Richard, anything that you want to share about that you're working on? You mentioned a little bit about joy. That your new book is coming out soon. Anything that you want to share in closing?
No, I just in something my wife and I say a lot is kind of a final exhortation is like in many ways these things are really simple. You know, they seem complex and they seem but coming back to your point about mercy is like really the only thing you can do is love the person in front of you. And that might be difficult or hard, but that's really the only thing that we're asked ever to do in these situations. And so yeah, it's going to be a tough year to love each other well through this year, but I don't know any other way to get through anything other than to love and love people as well as you can. And so let's all try to do that. We're going to be tested this year, but I think with the Lord's help, there's some beautiful things that can happen as well.
Thanks, Richard.